Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and injustice. That was Robert Kennedy's first major speech. He was visiting Cape Town, South Africa in 1966 during the height of apartheid. The official government, led by minority whites, refused to meet with him or even acknowledge his visit. He'd already been Attorney General under his brother John Kennedy, although he wasn't yet running for president. But he took a risk and visited South Africa at a time well before there was much sympathy for the apartheid cause. He wanted to be careful about offending the official government, but really there was no way around that. And he directly called for action. In fact, he asked the young people of South Africa to lead a revolution and reminded them of three dangers: futility, practicality, and commitment. He warned them against all three of those things, basically calling for them to be bold and stand up. And of course, as you heard in my example, he used beautiful symbolic language, metaphors, emotion, all of the things you've been learning about in Persuasion. By the way, the crowd of 18,000 people at the University of Cape Town gave a thunderous applause and a long standing ovation. It also helped launch Robert Kennedy on the international stage. By the way, Robert Kennedy mentioned Athens, Greece in that speech, which is a nice segue for us. I've been trying to talk about ancient Greece for a while now, and it's time, but I'll try to make this interesting. Before the 5th century BC, back beyond 500 BC, Greece was literally a lawless place. Most of the continent was unrefined. There were regular clashes across the Aegean Sea between Greece, Persia, Sparta. Geography played a factor. Greece is essentially at the southern tip of Europe, east of Italy, just across the Mediterranean from North Africa. The Aegean Sea is this inlet from the Mediterranean, which has these seaside countries essentially facing each other. To put it in perspective, Athens is closer to Benghazi, Libya, and Istanbul, Turkey, than it is to Rome, and it's a long way from Western Europe. So their world revolved around the Aegean Sea. The first war between the Greeks and Persians was in 492 BC. They fought again around 480 BC, then fought the Spartans in 431 BC. If you saw the movie 300, King Leonidas of Sparta actually fought the Persians, not the Greeks, from Athens. Anyway, there were a lot of incursions for 70 years, which led to lots of disputes over property. By 420 BC, there was a Greek legal system. It involved a jury of essentially referees who would vote on the winner of an argument between two people. So if you wanted to get your house back, you would go to court and argue your case, and a jury of peers would vote. So in this environment, persuasion became really important. In this era, the sophists became popular as roving teachers. Now, they taught all kinds of stuff: history, life, politics, what they knew about the universe, but much of what they taught was rhetoric. They would take money, sometimes a lot of it, to teach people, and it was a culture with a strong oral tradition, no written word yet. They had some critics because they charged so much and only aristocrats could afford to pay them. But they are the origin of the word sophistry, which we use today, which basically is an insult calling someone a storyteller, a liar. When these classical Greeks did start writing things down, one of the earliest books was called Sophist, and it was written by a guy named Plato. Plato wasn't a fan of later sophists and did indeed think they were unethical, manipulative, deceptive. He did respect the earlier sophists who had a more selfless view of the importance of education, and you read about Protagoras in your reading. Protagoras fathered a couple of challenging doctrines: subjectivity and opposites. Subjectivity was like postmodern thinking. Nothing is real. It's all a matter of perspective. It's relativism. Opposites, it's intriguing because it suggests that at any given time, we can have two opposing views and yet defend both. A great example is the earlier reading in Dissonance about the girl who was suing the college over her hazing for the sorority, but was still excited to be a member of the sorority. Since relativists question everything, Protagoras questioned the existence of the Greek gods. Well, the gods must not have liked that because he was banished. One of the first sophists to really get the power of persuasive speaking was Gorgias. He came about 100 years after Protagoras and really exercised the art of changing attitudes through rhetoric. By the way, this is a complete aside, but my dragon dictation kept changing Gorgias to Gorgias, and I think he was probably the short, bald guy. Anyway, Gorgias had a bit of relativism left in him. He was the first to write about considering the audience in a speech. Rather than being exacting and factual in his speeches, he focused on making them appropriate for the message and crowd. So there's an element of giving folks what they want in a Gorgian-style speech. Sicilian Corax wrote the first book on rhetoric. He was a fan of what's called prescriptive rhetoric. That word, prescriptive, may sound familiar from when I talked about beliefs and attitudes. Those are descriptive, how things are, and prescriptive, which is normative, agitating for change. Corax was about using rhetoric to change things. Where these guys all differ from Plato was that he wasn't at all relativistic. Plato believed in an absolute truth, fixed knowledge that men could learn, which belonged to the elites to bestow on the masses. None of this different perspective stuff. Aristotle falls somewhere in between. He wasn't about the status quo, but he also wasn't about agitating for big changes in society. He was really the first scholar of rhetoric, cataloging how people did it in an effort to learn how it worked. Aristotle wrote 3 books, all called Rhetoric. The first was about the speaker, the second about the audience, the third about the speech. And he actually wrote 2,500 years ago that rhetoric was defined as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. He introduced, really discovered from the sophists before him, but was the first to write it down, the 3 most important concepts in rhetoric and persuasion. They are ethos, logos, and pathos. These words, 2 millennia later, still have analogs in the English language: ethics, logic, and passion. Ethos is about the character of the speaker or source. Logos is the logic, facts of your argument. Pathos is the emotional appeal. I will tell you right now, if you don't have all 3 in your speech, you'll be in trouble. Now, 500 years later, Rome was flourishing, as anyone who knows the Bible can tell you. And Rome, around the time of Jesus, was the global center of knowledge, learning, and rhetoric. I have a favorite character from Catholic history and rhetoric, and I'm Catholic, but I won't talk smack about anyone. We'll get to him shortly. The Romans, as a society, believed in an ethical element to rhetoric, and not just the words, but the man. He and his message should be respectful, ethical, good. A very early Roman scholar, Cicero, was there around the time Jesus was alive in Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Judea. Cicero took a more practical approach. Rhetoric was important in Roman society. Exceptional communication skills were a mark of distinction and could be used to make things better for all. And Rome and Latin were both pretty complex, so good rhetoric required training. So his 2 contributions were a desire to teach good rhetoric and to reiterate the Roman belief that a man and his message were intertwined, that a man and his message were both expected to be ethical and good. Your head's probably hurt right now from all this ancient history, so on the topic of Rome, you all know the famous story of Julius Caesar and his betrayal by Brutus. It's the story made famous in an eponymous play by Shakespeare. In 1953, a budding young actor got the role of a lifetime as Mark Antony in the film version of Julius Caesar. I want you to go watch this epic speech, delivered in Shakespeare's iambic pentameter, but in a way that I think you'll understand. You don't have to blog about this, but look carefully for sarcasm in this speech, which is a very important persuasive moment in the film. Then grab your toga and come back here. So what do you think of that? And while the film is from 1953, Shakespeare wrote it in like the 15th century, 500 years ago. That's a pretty snarky speech that goes after Brutus hard with all of that Brutus says so and Brutus is an honorable man. It's not a terribly subtle way at all to say Brutus isn't honorable at all and he had no cause to kill Caesar. So it's interesting how insulting a compliment can be, isn't it? It's a really elegant, slick way to diss somebody. All right, I mentioned one of my favorite Catholics, and here he is, Aurelius Augustinus Hipponensis, known today as St. Augustine, or my favorite, St. Austin. He came around 400 years after the founding of the church, after Jesus walked the streets of the Holy Land. Augustine was a bishop in a Roman province in Africa. At that time, the thinking in the church was that your message, your sermon or preaching, was divinely inspired by God, so just being reverent and holy was enough to make you an influential speaker. Augustine wasn't so sure. So again, back to that concept of descriptive versus prescriptive. Augustine was normative, a big advocate for changing and improving things. He was the father of the idea that everyone is born with sin and so needs to be baptized to eliminate that sin. He was a founder of the concept called just war theory, which is still taught in war colleges today. That's the idea that in the case of, for example, the oppression of the Nazis, that it's better from the perspective of sin to go to war than to remain at peace. Pretty controversial stuff, and that extended to a skepticism about God's divine ability to make all preachers effective. So Augustine advocated for teaching priests to be better communicators, to make them better able to proselytize the faith. His goal in classic normative or prescriptive fashion was to get more people to become Catholic and to get those already in the fold to be more active and faithful. He wasn't rejecting God by any means. In fact, he considered that this was done in service to God. He just thought men could use a little help. The tools of rhetoric, crafting an argument, employing emotion, logic, nudging people toward making a decision of their own free will, all of that appears regularly in preaching. Here are a couple of great examples. Polar opposites politically, but employing the same methods. Again, take a look at these 2 preachers. Don't blog anything yet, and I'll see you back here shortly. So did you see any similarities? Both had challenging messages, but in very different ways. Both clearly exhort change in behavior. Graham wants more people to have more of a relationship with the Bible and Jesus. Flager says he's non-political, but he's essentially making a political argument in the church about race and politics. You couldn't see the crowd at Graham's event, although they were pretty emotional, but Flager had choir members leaping to their feet, dancing, laughing, applauding. So whether you're changing minds or not, you can see the role of emotion as a tool for engagement. And preachers aren't immune. If you want folks to pay attention, consider emotion and drama. It at least keeps them awake. In the church, there's even another motivation. Jack Lemmon, the actor from The Odd Couple, Grumpy Old Men, the classic 12 Angry Men, Lemmon starred in a movie called Mass Appeal, in which he played a priest. He has a great line in there where he's mentoring a young seminarian. He talks about the importance of a compelling, entertaining message and says it's no accident the collection comes after the sermon. I think some of the gentler televangelists are only trying to persuade people to part with their money, and so they have the least challenging message possible. Now, speaking of challenging messages, Dillard and Shen, in the Sage Handbook of Persuasion, mentioned that the 18th and 19th centuries were, quote, the most prolific eras in rhetorical history. This is a time of tremendous enlightenment, the time of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution. It's one of the most significant eras impacting the most people of all time, at least up until the 20th century. There's a spectacular and unusual speech from that area, mid-19th century, which you're all familiar with, but you may not know the backstory on. At that time, the mid-1800s, speeches were long. George Washington's farewell address in 1796 was 6,000 words. The Lincoln-Douglas debates for the Senate seat in Illinois in 1858 were typically an hour and a half or more. So Washington's farewell was 6,000 words. This speech I'm going to have you read was only 272. It was shocking at the time because not only were people used to a long speech, but it was part of the show. Remember, this was 50 years before radio and there wasn't much else to do. So people would go to a political speech expecting to be entertained for a big chunk of their day. This speech barely lasted 3 minutes. It was also a shock for what it didn't do. Has anybody guessed what the speech is yet? November 19th, 1863, in a field in Pennsylvania. It's Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln went there barely 3 months after the Battle of Gettysburg. 8,000 soldiers, both Union and Confederate, died in a 3-day battle. There were 50,000 total casualties on both sides. It was a catastrophe on both sides, but a key victory for the Union, which protected Washington, D.C. from the Confederates. 3.5 months later, on November 19th, Lincoln went to dedicate a cemetery on the site of the battle. Now, what makes this unique is that the cemetery was dedicated to and contained only Union troops. But Lincoln, even though he was commander-in-chief of the Union, addressed soldiers from both armies in the speech. So this speech was highly unusual for 2 reasons. 1, the length. 2, for its charity to the Confederates. The whole idea of this message is that Americans died here, but that America must live. Go read this address. Again, don't blog yet. Don't worry, you'll have some blogging coming up. And then come back here. Given everything I told you, that was pretty powerful stuff. A dedication to all the men who fell, not just the Union, and an appeal to settle their differences for the sake of the nation, all in 3 minutes. So let me talk about some obligatory recent history from the Sage Handbook. They mention religious fanaticism in the 16th and 17th centuries. Church leaders had taken over big parts of society in Europe by the 1500s, and both citizens and monarchs resented it. This was also the age in 1517 and 18 when Martin Luther was challenging the church, when Henry VIII, wanting freedom of divorce, left Catholicism to found the Church of England. And some philosophers, Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, led this movement after that to convince people to essentially shelve their personal motivations and to get along and agree to a more common, accepted way of thinking. It was called the polite arts. Now, think about Marlon Brando as Mark Antony or Father Flager in the Trinity Church and ask yourself, were they trying to be polite? Not even. But what the thinking of these American philosophers did is to expand the teaching of rhetoric, both spoken and written. They also viewed rhetoric as more pedestrian, daily thing, a tool of teaching, but not necessarily persuasion. Kenneth Burke in the mid-50s resurrected the concept of rhetoric as a persuasive tool. And because he was an academic who took a scholarly approach, it really opened the floodgates on the study of rhetoric. Remember me mentioning that I liked Perloff's use of the word object because it's a common term in academia to refer to all sorts of things, people, places, ideas. There are a couple of other terms in here that are along the same lines as object. One is symbol, like symbolic language, as we've discussed before. Brando using honorable man. That was a symbol of a cherished concept in Rome, the concept of honorable men, and probably the nastiest thing he could say in that context. It was symbolic language. Burke used identification a little bit the same. Identification refers to the connection you have with, well, anything you connect with. It could be another person, it could be food, a tree, an animal. You identify with the object in some way. The U.S., of course, was founded in a revolutionary way so that the country was governed by the people. That was a reversal of any previous government. But the Founding Fathers were also afraid that a clever persuader could do real harm by convincing enough people to misbehave. So they built precautions into the Constitution against complete anarchy of the people, like divided government, a bicameral legislature, states' rights. That chapter ends with a discussion on how the study of rhetoric has evolved in the era of mass media. That, again, is a timely segue for me. The 1960s was a period of tremendously powerful rhetoric in the U.S. It was persuasive, emotive, important. The issues on the table were U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the spread of communism, civil rights, poverty. And as you know, some of the leaders in these areas paid with their lives. Remember that definition of persuasion? Symbolic language, an intent to persuade, an ethical approach, an attempt to get people to change their own minds. That becomes more important when you're trying to move a mountain. You can't push it. You have to convince lots of people to help you, and you have to do it in a gentle, persuasive way. Next, you're going to watch a snippet of a familiar speech, a very powerful and emotional attempt at a nearly impossible persuasion. Think back to the Why We Fight films and how a two-sided message often worked better. It openly embraced the difficulty ahead, but told soldiers about it in an effort to prepare and persuade them. Often, when your task is very difficult, it's best to prepare people for the difficulty ahead. So Martin Luther King's two goals were to reach new ears with this message, to try to recruit new support, and to bolster the 250,000 people in his audience to be ready for the difficult task ahead. This speech was in 1963, well into the Civil Rights Movement. Nearly a decade after Emmett Till was killed, after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. It was just a year before the Civil Rights Act passed in Congress. So this wasn't a time for subtlety or cultivation. This was time to swing for the fences. You will blog here finally. Think about all the many concepts we discussed about persuasion and pick out as many as you can and just briefly note them in this blog after you watch this historic speech. Nicely done, guys. That was August 1963. Less than 5 years later, Martin Luther King was dead. Shot to death on a hotel balcony in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. That night, word spread around the country about the assassination. But remember, people didn't have the internet, smartphones, 24-hour cable. King was shot around dinner time, and it took some time for word to get around. Robert Kennedy was campaigning for president and was in Indianapolis that day. He got word just as he was about to address the crowd. This is most definitely a persuasive, rhetorical message that you're about to see, and it was off the cuff. Think about the period. I mean, King was murdered by James L. Ray specifically because Ray was a racist. In 1964 in Harlem, 65 in Watts and Los Angeles, 66 in Cleveland, and Chicago and San Francisco, there were race riots. They went on for days, and a lot of the protest was about economic disparities and racism. So the country was already a tinderbox at that time. Robert Kennedy clearly had that recent history in mind when he stepped up to the microphone in Indianapolis that day in April 1968, a speech that he was uniquely qualified to give. Give that a listen and go back to the blog and give your thoughts on what messages you picked up, who he was trying to persuade to do what. I'll see you in a minute. Two months later, Robert Kennedy was dead, killed in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Kennedy, like in many, many great speeches, quoted from previous speakers. People cite philosophers, politicians, generals, and poets. Kennedy cited a poet, Aeschylus, who lived in the area of Plato, Aristotle, the Sophists in Greece around 500 BC. Sometimes that reference to history or phrase from poetry can be just perfect. So two phrases in particular from the Gettysburg Address. When Lincoln says as his final line, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth," it's an oblique reference to both the preamble of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which prominently mention the people and our authority over government. Since the Gettysburg Address, though, his line "of the people, by the people," and another great line of his, "Those honored dead gave their last full measure of devotion." Both of those lines get cribbed regularly in other speeches. You'll know you have a great line when other people steal it. A variation of that got used in the National Treasure movies. John Gillespie Magee Jr. was a young British poet in the 1930s. Inspired by his friends who died in World War I, he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in October 1940 to fight in World War II, and his poetry began to reflect his love of aviation. He wrote a poem, High Flight, which earned him a bit of a cult following in the aviation community. My favorite line from Aviation isn't High Flight or any other poem. It's Shepard's Prayer. Alan Shepard, America's first astronaut, who I met in 1992. It goes like this: God, please don't let me F this up. Anyway, here's High Flight. I just wanted you to glance at it for a minute before you go watch this next speech. This next one always touches me, partly because I covered this story, the Space Shuttle Challenger tragedy, in January 1986, and because this speech is just so well delivered. President Reagan postponed the State of the Union address that year and instead gave this speech live on national television. It was called A Moment of National Healing, and it almost always gets me emotional. Give it a look, no blogging, then come back. No drama in the voice, no charisma, no tricks, just eyes on the camera, a somber voice, and a powerful message. This speech is all about the words. In that sense, it's a lot like Robert Kennedy's speech the night of the MLK assassination. It's calm on purpose to prevent emotion. Sometimes that's just the right strategy, and sometimes, like in this case, it can make it more emotional. Okay, I don't want to leave you like that, crying on your computer, so we're going to end with some fun. You saw the speech from Brando, of course, as Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Sometimes we get a great speech from fiction, from a book or film. There's a speech in one novel, Atlas Shrugged, that goes on for 70 pages. Your speeches only need to be about half that long. Here's a fun speech from fiction, from a film. Note the persuasive and rhetorical elements: emotion, drama, soaring rhetoric, even music. Watch the Vendetta one first, then watch the real-life speech given by a Georgia Tech sophomore in August of 2013 to welcome new engineering students to the program. You do not have to blog about this. All right, last thoughts for the day. I told you to save the Gerald Ford chapter for last because it's a much better read. I love how it opens with that vignette where a professional speechwriter is thinking, wow, he got a really good speechwriter to knock out this first draft. This is much better than the stuff we used to write for him. And it turns out Ford wrote the speech himself. That's a sign of not only how nice he was as a person, Ford, because he deferred all those years to those speechwriters and didn't make them change their style to his, but it's also a sign of leadership. He hired people to do a job, in this case many of whom worked for Nixon, and concentrated on making important decisions and not micromanaging. And then, when real leadership was required in an important speech, he did it himself with the Sunday surprise. Ford told almost nobody, just half a dozen people, that he even intended to pardon Nixon, and hardly anybody helped him craft the message. He wanted it all on his own shoulders and wrote the speech himself. He knew it was almost certain to cost him the subsequent election, and that combined with an economic slowdown did indeed cost him the race to Jimmy Carter. To this day, Gerald Ford is the only president in the history of the U.S. who was never elected president. And yet he felt like the message was so important, the decision so necessary, that he went forward with it. Now there's a lot of criticism, and rightly so, that this was a deal struck before Nixon ever picked Ford to be the vice president. Remember, Nixon was elected twice with Spiro Agnew as his vice president, but Agnew had to resign in 1973 over tax evasion charges. The president, of course, picks a replacement, and he chose Michigan Senator Gerald Ford. This was while Watergate was already boiling, so a lot of people assumed Nixon made a deal for a pardon before handpicking Ford to sit in the Oval Office. Really, the only defense against that allegation is that Ford was a guy known his whole life for high character. His argument, of course, was that no good could come from a national prosecution, that to heal the country it was best to put Watergate to rest. As Gergen notes, sometimes the best real test of leadership is for the leader to fall on the sword, and that's essentially what Ford did in the interest of the country. Okay, your speeches, they will be on video, and they need to be about 5 minutes. I don't mind at all if you look down at notes. Just try to avoid reading the whole thing. Emphasize all the details we discussed about technique. Especially think about ethos, logos, and pathos, your personal credibility, your logical arguments, and an emotional appeal. They do not have to have a call for action, but that's not a bad idea. They can be as simple or as elaborate as you'd like. These will not be graded on the video quality, so if you'd like to have 2001: A Space Odyssey play under your speech, just play it off the computer. If it sounds tinny, who cares? I'll get the gist. Remember the tips from Gas and Cider. You probably can't get a rock star to introduce you, but you're welcome to include that if you want to. I can see Cliff Kingsbury now. My good friend, grad student. I would like to have them all published to YouTube, and you may not make them private. You can, though, make them unlisted, so they aren't searchable. Then you can email me the link. Public is just fine if you'd like. I will email you all of the details, what day and time they're due, etc. Be looking around for speeches as examples. You are perfectly allowed to borrow from a previous speech or poem or movie by including a quote or paraphrase from there. You can use humor, fear. You can yell and bang your desk, or you can be really calm like Robert Kennedy. This speech should be about something that you either have expertise in or interest in, and it should persuade us to do something, even if it's just to like something that you like. Good luck, and as always, email with questions.